The Massachusetts pines whispered secrets that October evening in 1978, their branches swaying in the unseasonably warm breeze that carried the scent of decay and something else, something that made Detective Ray Sullivan's skin crawl as he stepped deeper into the Freetown Fall River State Forest. He'd been a cop for 15 years, had seen his share of horrors, but nothing had prepared him for what lay ahead in these 5,000 acres of woodland that locals had begun calling cursed. The radio crackled on his belt. "Sullivan, you find anything yet?" He pressed the button, his thumb trembling slightly. "Not yet, dispatch. But I can feel it. Something's wrong out here." The search for 15-year-old Mary Lou Arruda had been going on for 2 months. The Raynham cheerleader had vanished without a trace in September, leaving behind only her bicycle and a community gripped by fear. Ray had worked missing persons cases before: runaways, custody disputes, the occasional tragedy. But Mary Lou was different. Good family, good grades, no reason to disappear. And now, with Halloween approaching, the whispers in town had grown darker. "The forest takes them," old-timers would mutter over coffee at the diner. "Always has. Always will." Ray pushed through a thicket of scrub oak, his flashlight beam dancing across the forest floor. The official search parties had combed these woods for weeks, but something had drawn him back here tonight, alone. Call it instinct, call it desperation, he'd learned to trust those feelings that made his gut tighten and his pulse quicken. The beam of his flashlight caught something pale ahead. At first, he thought it was just another birch tree, their white bark ghostly in the darkness. But as he moved closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a rope. Old, weathered hemp rope tied around the trunk of a massive pine tree. And hanging from it was what remained of Mary Lou Arruda. Ray's hands shook as he radioed for backup, his voice barely steady enough to give coordinates. The scene would haunt him for the rest of his career and beyond. But what he didn't know that night, what none of them could have imagined, was that Mary Lou's murder was just the beginning. The forest had tasted blood, and it wanted more. 1 year later, Fall River had changed. The industrial city had always been rough around the edges, its glory days as a textile powerhouse long past, but now there was something else in the air. Fear walked the streets with the prostitutes and drug dealers who haunted the shadows near the Kakekin River. And in those shadows, a man who called himself Satan was gathering followers. Carl Drew didn't look like evil incarnate. 26 years old, average height, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through people. He was a pimp, nothing more than a street criminal living off women who had nowhere else to turn. But Carl had discovered something powerful: fear wrapped in mysticism could control people in ways violence alone never could. "You belong to me now," he would tell the girls who worked for him. "Body and soul. And if you cross me, you'll learn what Satan's wrath really means." The abandoned mill buildings near the waterfront became his kingdom, but when he needed to remind his followers who held their lives in his hands, Carl would lead them into the Freetown Forest. There, among trees that had witnessed centuries of violence from Native American raids to colonial witch trials to Civil War deserters who died alone in the wilderness, he would perform his rituals. Doreen Levesque had been working the streets since she was 16. At 17, she was already worn down by a life that offered few choices and fewer hopes. But when she started talking about leaving, about breaking free from Carl's control, her fate was sealed. The last time anyone saw Doreen alive, she was walking toward Mill Street on October 13, 1979. 3 days later, her body was found in the woods behind a housing project. She'd been beaten, tortured, and killed with what appeared to be ritualistic precision. The medical examiner would later testify that her wounds were consistent with some kind of ceremonial murder. But it was what the police didn't find that made veteran cops wake up in cold sweats. Doreen's blood had been drained almost completely from her body. And carved into the tree nearest to where she lay were symbols that no one wanted to decipher too closely. Detective Paul Carey had taken over the Freetown Forest cases after Ray Sullivan requested a transfer. The Mary Lou Arruda murder had broken something in the older cop's spirit, and Paul didn't blame him. These weren't normal murders. They were something else entirely, something that made rational men question everything they thought they knew about the world. "We're dealing with a cult," Paul told his partner as they stood over Doreen's crime scene. "Has to be. No random killer does this kind of work." His partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, nodded grimly. "Question is, how many of them are there? And where do they go to ground?" The answer came sooner than either man wanted. Robin Murphy was 19 and desperate. She'd been in Carl Drew's stable for 6 months, working the streets to feed his drug habit and his growing delusions of grandeur. But Robin was different from the other girls. She was smarter, more observant, and she was beginning to see through Carl's satanic theater to the calculated predator beneath. "He's not really Satan," she confided to her friend Karen Marsden one cold November evening. "He's just a sick bastard who uses that devil worship crap to scare people. But the things he makes us do in those woods. Karen, I think he's killed before. I think he's going to kill again." Karen Marsden was 21, a mother of 2 who'd turned to prostitution when her factory job disappeared and the welfare checks weren't enough to feed her children. She'd been with Carl longer than most, had survived his rages and his rituals by being useful to him in ways that went beyond the street corner. She was his lieutenant, his enforcer among the women, and she knew where all the bodies were buried literally. "You don't understand," Karen whispered back. "It's not just theater. I've seen things in those woods, Robin. Things that don't belong in this world. The forest is alive, and it's hungry. Carl doesn't control the darkness, he feeds it." But Robin Murphy had made up her mind. She was going to the police, going to tell them everything she knew about Carl Drew and his cult of broken women and damaged men who gathered in the Freetown Forest to dance around fires and spill blood on ancient stones. She never got the chance. On November 9, 1979, Robin Murphy's beaten and tortured body was found in the woods behind a Fall River housing project. Like Doreen Levesque before her, she'd been killed with ritualistic precision. But this time, the killer had left a calling card. Robin's head had been severed from her body and placed carefully on a tree stump, facing west toward the Freetown Forest. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who betray Satan's chosen. Paul Carey stood over Robin's remains and felt something inside him break. 2 young women, both connected to the streets, both killed in ways that spoke of organized ritual murder. And both with connections to a man who was beginning to think he was the devil himself. "We need to get into those woods," Paul told his captain. "Whatever's happening out there, it's escalating. These aren't random killings, they're sacrifices." Captain Morrison looked at the crime scene photos spread across his desk and shook his head. "You think this Carl Drew character is really running some kind of satanic cult?" "I think he's convinced a bunch of desperate people that he's got supernatural power," Paul replied. "And I think he's using that belief to commit murder. The question is, how many more have to die before we can stop him?" The answer would come in February, with the death of Karen Marsden. The winter of 1980 was brutal, even by New England standards. Snow fell early and often, turning the Freetown Forest into a pristine white wilderness that hid the darkness beneath. But for those who knew where to look, the signs were still there, strange symbols carved into trees, the charred remains of ceremonial fires, and an overwhelming sense that something ancient and malevolent had awakened in these woods. Karen Marsden had been living on borrowed time since Robin Murphy's murder. She knew too much, had seen too much, and Carl Drew was beginning to view her as a liability rather than an asset. But Karen had her own plans. She'd been gathering evidence, keeping records of Carl's activities, documenting the locations where the cult performed their rituals. She was going to bring down Satan's kingdom, even if it cost her everything. "I know where the bodies are," she told Detective Carey during a secret meeting in January. "Not just Doreen and Robin. There are others. People who disappeared over the years, people who ended up in those woods because they crossed Carl or knew too much or just happened to be in the wrong place when he needed someone to bleed." Paul leaned forward across the table of the all-night diner where they'd arranged to meet. "How many others, Karen?" "I don't know for sure. But the forest. It's like a graveyard out there. And Carl, he doesn't just kill people. He feeds them to something. Something that lives in the deep woods, something that's been there since before the white man ever set foot in Massachusetts." "Karen, you're talking about..." "I'm talking about the truth," she interrupted. "You think this is just about a crazy pimp who likes to play dress up and scare people? You haven't been out there at night, detective. You haven't seen the things that come when the fires are lit and the blood is spilled. Carl Drew isn't Satan, but something in those woods is close enough." Paul arranged for protection for Karen, but in a city stretched thin by budget cuts and overwhelmed by crime, one woman's safety couldn't be guaranteed around the clock. And Carl Drew had eyes and ears everywhere on the streets of Fall River. On February 8, 1980, Karen Marsden attended what she thought would be her last cult gathering. She'd worn a wire, hoping to capture evidence that would finally put Carl Drew away for good. What she got instead was a death sentence. The ritual that night was different from the others. Instead of the usual abandoned mill or empty warehouse, Carl led his followers deep into the Freetown Forest, to a clearing where massive stones formed a rough circle around a fire pit that looked like it had been in use for centuries. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rocks, symbols that predated any European settlement in the area. Tonight, Carl announced to the shivering group of prostitutes and drug addicts who made up his congregation, "We offer a special sacrifice to the darkness that gives us power. One among us has betrayed the covenant, has spoken to the agents of the false god who would see us destroyed." Karen felt the eyes of the group turn toward her, saw the fear and resignation in faces she'd known for months. These people weren't evil, they were desperate, broken, manipulated by a man who understood that the promise of power, even dark power, could make people do unspeakable things. "You all know the price of betrayal," Carl continued, his voice carrying over the crackling of the fire. "You know what happens to those who would destroy our family, our sacred mission." What happened next would become the subject of conflicting testimonies, disputed evidence, and years of legal proceedings. But one thing was certain: Karen Marsden died that night in the Freetown Forest, and her death was unlike anything investigators had seen before. Her body was found 2 days later by a state park ranger, partially buried under a pile of stones in a clearing about a mile from where she had last been seen alive. The medical examiner's report was sealed, but word leaked out: Karen had been tortured for hours before her death, and her body showed signs of having been used in some kind of ritualistic ceremony. But it was what they found around the crime scene that made even hardened cops question their sanity. The trees in a 30-foot radius around Karen's grave were all dead, their bark blackened as if by some supernatural fire. The ground itself seemed scorched, though there was no evidence of any actual flames. And carved into every tree were symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of the eye. The arrests came quickly after Karen's murder. Paul Carey had built a network of informants on the street, and once word got out that Carl Drew's protection couldn't save his followers from the law, people started talking. Robin Murphy's friend Carol Fletcher came forward with a story that would dominate headlines for months. She'd witnessed Karen's murder, she said, had watched as Carl Drew and his inner circle tortured the young woman to death in a satanic ritual designed to appease the dark forces that lived in the Freetown Forest. But as the case went to trial, cracks began to appear in the prosecution's narrative. Carol Fletcher's story changed multiple times, key details shifted depending on who was asking the questions, and evidence that should have been conclusive turned out to be frustratingly ambiguous. "The problem," Paul explained to his wife one sleepless night, "is that we're trying to prosecute a case that doesn't fit into normal categories. How do you explain to a jury that the defendant believes he's Satan? How do you present evidence of ritualistic murder without sounding like you belong in a mental hospital yourself?" The trial stretched on for years. Carl Drew was eventually convicted of first-degree murder in Karen Marsden's death and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Several of his followers received lesser sentences for their roles in the cult murders. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the darkness in the Freetown Forest wasn't finished with Fall River. Detective Paul Carey retired in 1985, 5 years after Karen Marsden's murder. The cases had taken their toll on him, had changed something fundamental in his worldview. But he couldn't stay away from the forest entirely. Once or twice a year, he would drive out to the state park, walk the trails, and try to make sense of what he'd witnessed during those terrible months in 1979 and 1980. "You feel it too, don't you?" Paul turned to find an elderly man standing on the trail behind him. Native American, probably in his 70s, with eyes that seemed to have seen far too much. "Feel what?" Paul asked. "The hunger," the old man replied. "The darkness that lives in these woods. My people knew about it centuries before your people arrived. We called it the Wendigo, the thing that devours. We knew better than to feed it." Paul studied the stranger's face. "You're talking about the murders." "I'm talking about what came before the murders, what caused them, and what's still here now." The old man gestured toward the deeper woods. "You're Carl Drew," he thought he was controlling the darkness. Truth is, it was controlling him. It whispered to him in his dreams, showed him visions of power, convinced him that if he brought it enough blood, enough pain, enough terror, it would grant him his heart's desire. And what was his heart's desire? To become something more than human? To transcend the flesh and join the eternal darkness that feeds on suffering. The old man shook his head sadly. He never understood that the darkness doesn't share power, it only consumes it. Paul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Is it still here? This thing? It never left. It's been here since the world was young, sleeping in the deep places, waking only when the blood calls to it. Your Drew understood that much. The rituals, the sacrifices, they were all designed to rouse the ancient hunger. But Carl's in prison. The cult is broken up. The murders stopped. The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Did they? Or did you just stop looking in the right places? Paul thought about that conversation for months afterward. He started paying attention to the local news again, started tracking missing persons reports and unexplained deaths in the area around the Freetown Forest. What he found disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. The pattern was still there, just more subtle. A hiker who disappeared on a popular trail and was never found. A teenage couple whose car was discovered abandoned at a forest parking area, no sign of struggle, no explanation for their disappearance. A homeless man found dead under mysterious circumstances, his body showing signs of ritualistic mutilation. And always, the forest itself seemed to be growing darker, more threatening. Rangers reported equipment failures, unexplained phenomena, a sense of being watched by something vast and hostile. Hikers complained of disorientation, of trails that seemed to shift and change, of voices calling to them from the deep woods. By 1990, the Freetown Fall River State Forest had acquired a reputation as one of the most haunted places in New England. Paranormal investigators flocked to the area, hoping to document evidence of supernatural activity. Most left disappointed, but a few captured things on film and audio that defied easy explanation: strange lights moving through the trees, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, and shadows that moved independently of their sources. Sarah Chen was 23 when she moved to Fall River in 1995, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in forestry and a job with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. She'd heard the stories about Freetown Forest, of course the murders, the cult activities, the reported hauntings, but Sarah was a scientist. She believed in evidence, in rational explanations, in the power of human understanding to illuminate even the darkest mysteries. Her first assignment was to conduct a comprehensive ecological survey of the forest, documenting plant and animal populations, identifying areas of environmental concern, and developing management strategies for one of the state's most problematic parks. What she found would challenge everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The forest was dying. Not in the normal way that ecosystems change and evolve, but in a manner that seemed almost intentional, as if some malevolent intelligence was systematically destroying the delicate balance of life that had existed in these woods for thousands of years. Trees that should have been thriving were withering for no apparent reason. Wildlife populations were declining rapidly, with many species simply disappearing from areas where they'd lived for generations. And in certain parts of the forest, particularly in the deeper sections where the cult murders had taken place, the very soil seemed poisoned, incapable of supporting any form of life. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah told her supervisor during a monthly progress report. "It's as if something is actively working to kill the forest from within." Any idea what might be causing it? Industrial pollution? Acid rain? Some kind of bacterial infection? Sarah shook her head. "I've tested everything. The soil composition, the water quality, the air samples, nothing shows the kind of contamination that would explain this level of ecological collapse. Whatever's happening here, it's not following any natural pattern I've ever studied." But as Sarah spent more time in the forest, she began to notice other things that didn't fit into her scientific worldview. Animals behave strangely in certain areas, becoming agitated or aggressive for no apparent reason. Electronic equipment malfunctioned with unusual frequency, particularly GPS units and radio communications. And there were sounds in the deep woods, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife or natural phenomena. Most disturbing of all were the trees themselves. In the areas where the cult murders had taken place, ancient oaks and pines showed signs of what Sarah could only describe as intentional scarring. Not the random damage caused by weather or insects, but deliberate carvings that formed patterns and symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Someone's been using these trees for ritual purposes," she noted in her field journal. "The scarring is extensive and appears to have been done over many years, possibly decades. The symbols are consistent with reports of occult activity in the area during the late 1970s and early 1980s. But as Sarah photographed and cataloged the mysterious markings, she began to notice something that chilled her to the bone: the symbols were changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely changing. New lines appeared overnight, existing patterns shifted and evolved, and some markings disappeared entirely only to reappear in different locations. It was impossible, of course. Trees didn't carve themselves. But Sarah was a careful observer, and she trusted her own eyes. Something was actively modifying these symbols, something that worked in the darkness when no human witnesses were present. The breakthrough came in October 1997, on the 18th anniversary of Doreen Levesque's murder. Sarah had been working late in the forest, using night vision equipment to document nocturnal wildlife activity, when she stumbled upon something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Deep in the woods, in a clearing she'd never seen before despite having mapped every square inch of the forest, a group of people were conducting some kind of ceremony. At first, Sarah thought it might be teenagers playing with Ouija boards or college students trying to scare themselves with amateur ghost hunting. But as she watched through her binoculars, she realized this was something far more serious. The participants were adults, maybe a dozen of them, dressed in dark robes and arranged in a circle around a fire pit that looked like it had been in use for decades. They were chanting in a language Sarah didn't recognize, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to make the very air vibrate with tension. And in the center of the circle, bound to a wooden stake, was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Sarah reached for her radio to call for help, but the device was dead. She tried her cell phone, no signal. Her GPS unit showed only static. Every piece of electronic equipment she carried had mysteriously failed at the same moment. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The woman in the center of the circle was struggling against her bonds, her mouth gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah knew she had to do something, but she was outnumbered 12-1, and something about the entire scene filled her with a paralyzing dread that went beyond rational fear. The fire suddenly flared higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. And in those shadows, Sarah saw something that would shatter her scientific worldview forever: shapes that weren't quite human, entities that seemed to be made of living darkness, creatures that had answered the cultist's call and come to witness the sacrifice. The leader of the group raised a curved knife above his head, the blade reflecting the firelight like a fragment of concentrated malevolence. Sarah closed her eyes, unable to watch what was about to happen, and in that moment of darkness, the forest around her exploded into chaos. When she opened her eyes again, the clearing was empty. No fire, no cultists, no bound victim. Just ancient trees swaying in a wind that carried the scent of something that might have been blood, or might have been something far worse. Sarah ran. She crashed through underbrush, stumbled over roots, tore her clothing on thorns and branches as she fled toward the parking area where she'd left her truck. Only when she reached the relative safety of the main road did she dare to look back, and what she saw made her question her own sanity. The entire forest was glowing with a pale, sickly light that seemed to emanate from within the trees themselves. And rising above the canopy was something that couldn't be real, couldn't exist in the rational world she'd spent her life studying, a column of pure darkness that writhed and twisted like a living thing, reaching toward the stars with what looked like hunger incarnate. Sarah quit her job the next day. She moved back to California, changed careers, and tried to forget what she'd witnessed in the Freetown Forest. But some experiences burn themselves into the soul, becoming part of who you are in ways that can never be undone. 20 years later, she still wakes up some nights with the taste of that otherworldly darkness in her mouth, still dreams of shapes that move through shadows, still hears the echo of chanting that called something ancient and terrible into the world of human experience. Detective Maria Santos inherited the Freetown Forest files when she joined the Massachusetts State Police in 2010. By then, the cult murders of the late 1970s were considered cold cases, historical curiosities that occasionally drew the attention of true crime podcasters and paranormal investigators. But Maria had grown up in Fall River, had heard the stories from people who remembered Carl Drew and his followers, and she knew the darkness in those woods was far from dormant. The missing persons reports told the story that official statistics tried to hide. Over the past 30 years, more than 24 people had disappeared in or around the Freetown Forest. Some were hikers who strayed from marked trails and were never seen again. Others were local residents who simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind cars in forest parking areas and no trace of what might have happened to them. The pattern is consistent, Maria explained to her partner as they reviewed the files. Young adults, usually between 18 and 30, often with histories of drug use or involvement in prostitution. They disappear in the forest, and we never find so much as a bone fragment. Could be animal predation, her partner suggested. Bears, coyotes, they'd scatter remains pretty effectively. Maria shook her head. I've seen animal attacks. This is different. These people aren't being killed by wildlife, they're being taken. And whoever's taking them knows how to dispose of bodies in ways that leave no trace. The breakthrough came in 2015, when a group of urban explorers equipped with high-tech recording equipment captured something extraordinary during a nighttime expedition into the deepest parts of the forest. Their video footage, later posted to YouTube before being quickly taken down by authorities, showed clear evidence of organized cult activity, robed figures conducting rituals around fires, chanting in ancient languages, and performing sacrifices that the explorers claimed involved human victims. But it was the audio recording that truly disturbed investigators. Buried beneath the human voices and the crackling of flames was something else, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if something vast and ancient was responding to the cultists' summons. Maria led a task force into the forest, but they found nothing. No evidence of fires, no ritual sites, no sign that anyone had been in those woods for months. The GPS coordinates from the urban explorers' equipment led to empty clearings where nothing unusual had ever taken place. It's like they know we're coming, Maria told her captain after the third failed raid. Like they have some kind of early warning system that lets them disappear before we can catch them. Or like they're not really there, her captain replied grimly. Maybe what those kids filmed wasn't happening in our world at all. The truth about the Freetown Forest came to light in 2018, through the testimony of a dying man who claimed to have been part of the cult activities for more than 20 years. Thomas Brennan was 53, dying of cancer, and determined to clear his conscience before he met whatever judgment awaited him in the afterlife. It started with Carl Drew, he told Maria during a recorded confession. But it didn't end with him. The thing he awakened in those woods, the darkness he fed with blood and terror, it found other servants, other ways to sustain itself. According to Brennan, the cult had never really disbanded after Drew's arrest. It had simply evolved, becoming more careful, more selective about its activities. Where Drew had been flamboyant and reckless, the new leadership was methodical and secretive. They understood that the modern world had tools for tracking and surveillance that didn't exist in 1980, so they adapted their methods accordingly. We learned to hunt in the spaces between worlds, Brennan explained. The forest isn't just a place, it's a doorway. And when the conditions are right, when the proper rituals are performed, that doorway opens to reveal things that most people can't see, can't even imagine. The modern cult, according to Brennan, operated on a schedule tied to astronomical events and historical anniversaries. The murders of Doreen Levesque, Robin Murphy, and Karen Marsden had created what he called temporal anchors, dates when the barrier between the physical world and the realm of living darkness was at its thinnest. Every year on the anniversary of those deaths, the forest changes, he said. The trees grow thicker, the shadows deeper. Trails that exist during the day disappear at night, replaced by paths that lead to places that shouldn't exist. And in those places, the ancient hunger waits to be fed. Brennan described a sophisticated operation that targeted society's most vulnerable members, runaway teenagers, homeless individuals, people struggling with addiction or mental illness, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't generate extensive police investigation. The cult would lure these victims into the forest with promises of shelter, drugs, or companionship, then use them in rituals designed to strengthen the otherworldly entity that had made the Freetown Forest its home. The thing in the woods isn't Satan, Brennan insisted. It's older than any human religion, older than civilization itself. It existed before the first human learned to make tools, and it will exist long after our species is extinct. All it wants is to feed, to grow stronger, to eventually break free of the prison that keeps it confined to that one patch of Massachusetts woodland. Maria recorded hours of testimony from Brennan before he died, enough to fuel investigations for years to come. But when she tried to verify his claims, she hit the same wall that had frustrated law enforcement for decades. The evidence always disappeared, witnesses recanted their statements, and the forest itself seemed to actively resist any attempt to expose its secrets. Today, the Freetown Fall River State Forest remains open to the public, its hiking trails and camping facilities drawing thousands of visitors each year. Most experience nothing more unusual than the ordinary beauty of a New England woodland. But for those who know where to look, who venture into the deeper sections when conditions are right, the darkness that has claimed so many lives over the decades still waits. Park rangers report equipment failures, unexplained phenomena, and an unusually high number of search and rescue operations. Missing persons cases continue to accumulate at a rate that statistical analysis suggests is far above normal for a recreational area of this size. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the anniversaries align, hikers report sounds that don't belong in any natural environment, chanting that echoes through the trees, screams that seem to come from underground, and footsteps that follow them through the woods long after they've left the marked trails behind. The symbols carved into the ancient trees continue to change and evolve, as if guided by some intelligence that understands the power of written language to shape reality itself. New markings appear regularly, always in locations where no human could have accessed them, always following patterns that hurt to contemplate directly, and in the deepest parts of the forest, where the canopy grows so thick that sunlight never reaches the ground, something ancient and hungry continues to wait. It has learned patience over the centuries, has discovered that the slow accumulation of spiritual energy through ritualistic murder is more sustainable than the dramatic feeding frenzies that once drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. The cult that serves it has adapted as well, embracing technology and modern communication methods while maintaining the same core mission that has guided them for nearly half a century: feed the darkness, strengthen the entity that grants them power, and prepare for the day when the barriers between worlds finally collapse entirely. Detective Maria Santos continues to investigate the Freetown Forest cases, adding new files to an archive that now spans more than 4 decades. She knows that somewhere in those woods, the descendants of Carl Drew's original followers are still conducting their terrible ceremonies. She knows that more people will disappear, more families will be left without answers, more evidence will vanish into the supernatural maw that has made these 5,000 acres its eternal hunting ground. But she also knows something else, something that keeps her fighting despite the odds: the darkness in the Freetown Forest is not invincible. It can be contained, its influence limited, its hunger satisfied just enough to prevent it from growing beyond the boundaries that currently confine it. The price of that containment is measured in human lives, in the annual tribute of blood and terror that keeps an ancient evil from spreading beyond the pine trees and stone walls of one haunted patch of Massachusetts woodland. It's a price that has been paid for generations, and will likely be paid for generations to come. Because some hungers can never be truly satisfied, only temporarily appeased. And in the Freetown Fall River State Forest, the feeding never really stops. Based on documented crimes and unexplained phenomena that have occurred in the Freetown Fall River State Forest since 1978, including the murders of Mary Lou Arruda, Doreen Levesque, Robin Murphy, and Karen Marsden, the cult activities of Carl Drew and his followers, and the ongoing reports of missing persons and paranormal activity that continue to this day. Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.